There was a time when Delphi, Indiana, was just another quiet Midwestern town. A place where doors were left unlocked, where children rode their bikes until the sun dipped below the horizon, where life moved at the steady pace of familiarity. The kind of town where nothing ever happened, until it did. It was a town built on history, with a population barely scraping past 3,000. A place where everyone knew everyone, and generations of families had set their roots deep into the soil. The Monon High Bridge, an aging but beloved relic of the past, stood as a silent witness to time, stretching across Deer Creek. It was the kind of place you might drive through without a second thought, a town whose name rarely made it past county lines. But Delphi's peace would not last. On February 13, 2017, two teenage girls set out for an afternoon walk, unaware that their small town's name was about to be etched into history. Not for its charm, not for its heritage, but for something far darker. A crime so brutal, so haunting, that even years later its shadow still lingers. The air that day was crisp, the kind that carried the first hints of spring but still held on to winter's bite. It was a day like any other. Except it wasn't. Because this was the last day Abigail Williams and Liberty German would ever see. Abby and Libby. Best friends. The kind of friendship that felt unbreakable, built on laughter, shared secrets, and the innocence of youth. 13 and 14 years old, their lives were just beginning. They had dreams, inside jokes, favorite songs, and plans for the future. They were in every way ordinary teenagers. And maybe that's what makes what happened next so terrifying. Because it could have been anyone. It could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's friend. The Monon High Bridge Trail was a popular spot, a place where locals went to breathe in the fresh air, to take in the view from the towering wooden bridge that had stood for over a century. But for all its beauty, the bridge was dangerous. Narrow, without railings, its weathered wooden planks were uneven, some missing altogether. Crossing it required careful footing, a steady pace. It was thrilling in a way that made it a favorite hangout for teenagers looking for a little adventure. That Monday, Abby and Libby were dropped off near the trail by Libby's older sister. They planned to enjoy the mild afternoon, take pictures, maybe talk about school, their weekend plans, whatever was on their minds. They weren't supposed to be gone long, just a short walk, a few laughs, a fun memory. That's all it was supposed to be. At 2:09 p.m., Libby did something extraordinary. Something that would later be hailed as an act of incredible bravery, as the key to one of the most haunting mysteries of the modern era. She pressed record. The video lasts only seconds. The image is unsteady, the angle slightly tilted, and then there he is. A man, walking toward them, his hands in his pockets, his head slightly down. He wears a navy blue jacket, jeans, a hoodie pulled up over his head. His steps are measured, deliberate. He is getting closer. Then his voice. Guys, down the hill. 4 words. Calm, firm, commanding. A voice that expects to be obeyed. The video cuts off, and after that, nothing. The Monon High Bridge stretches 853 feet across Deer Creek, a narrow pathway with nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. By the time the sun set over Delphi, Abigail Williams and Liberty German were nowhere to be found. The moment Liberty German pressed record, she changed everything. In the face of something, someone, undeniably wrong, she reacted not with panic, not with hesitation, but with instinct. A simple press of a button, a decision made in seconds. And yet, that action would become the most crucial piece of evidence in the case. Without it, there would be only silence. But even with it, the questions outnumbered the answers. 4 words. 4 simple words, spoken in an even tone, almost casual, yet laced with an unspoken threat. Guys, down the hill. Not shouted, not screamed, but undeniable in their weight. The voice was firm, not frantic, not rushed. The voice of someone who expected obedience, someone who knew they were in control. And the girls, they listened. Somewhere beyond the edge of that grainy video, beyond the frame of the camera, beyond the last moment Liberty recorded, something happened. Something terrifying, something final. But what? The bridge was narrow, stretching over the creek with no way to escape. On one side, a steep drop into cold water and jagged rocks. On the other, a densely wooded area thick with trees and brush. If they ran, where could they go? If they screamed, who would hear them? The Monon High Bridge Trail was popular, but on that afternoon, they were alone. Or rather, alone with him. He was close enough for them to hear him, close enough for Libby to record him, and then the recording stopped. By 3 p.m., the girls were supposed to be back at their pickup spot. They weren't. Calls to their phones went unanswered. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then another. Concern began to tighten its grip on their families. Maybe they had lost track of time. Maybe their phone batteries had died. Maybe, hopefully, it was nothing. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the winter air grew colder, unease turned into fear. By evening, Delphi was searching. Friends, family, neighbors, flashlights in hand, voices calling out their names, walking the trails, checking the bridge, scanning the thick woods, hoping, praying for a response. Nothing. By nightfall, the police were involved. Search parties expanded. The darkness of the woods seemed endless. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that gnaws at the edges of the mind, the kind that whispers that something is very, very wrong. Still, they searched, because what else could they do? For hours they combed the area, calling, listening, but there was only silence. That night, many of them went home, still hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, when morning came, they would be found. Cold, scared, but safe. But morning came, and with it something else. Morning arrived in Delphi, but it brought no relief, no answers, no sign of Abby or Libby. The town, still holding on to a fragile hope, woke up to a search effort unlike anything it had seen before. Volunteers gathered. Law enforcement expanded their perimeter. Search dogs were brought in. The ground, still stiff from winter's lingering chill, bore the weight of countless footsteps. Footsteps retracing the path two girls had taken the day before. Footsteps searching for something, anything, that could explain why they never came home. The Monon High Bridge stood as it always had, silent, unmoving, indifferent. The creek below carried on, its waters flowing as they had for centuries. The trees whispered in the wind, but they told no secrets. No one knew what they would find. No one wanted to believe the worst. It was around noon when the search took them further down the trail, past the bridge, toward the creek. That's when someone saw something. Something out of place. Something unnatural in the quiet of the woods. And then, the call. Authorities were quick to respond, but by the time they arrived, it was already clear. The search was over. There, in a secluded area off the trail, near the banks of Deer Creek, lay the bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. The details of what was found that day remain closely guarded. Even years later, law enforcement has refused to release exactly what happened in that clearing. But what is known is this. What happened to those girls was not random. It was not an accident. It was not the result of getting lost in the woods. It was murder. Shockwaves rippled through Delphi, a town that had always felt safe, always felt untouched by the horrors of the outside world, was now the center of a crime so dark, so brutal, that it seemed unimaginable. Parents clutched their children tighter. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted shut. Fear settled over the town like a heavy fog, and with it, an urgent question. Who did this? Law enforcement worked quickly to secure the scene, to begin piecing together what little evidence they had. But as investigators looked over the area, over the creek, over the worn path that led to that place, they realized something chilling. Whoever had done this had vanished, completely, without a trace. The killer had walked these same woods, had stood in this very spot, had left his mark in the most horrifying way possible, and then he was gone. But he hadn't left empty-handed. He had taken something with him. The peace of a small town, the innocence of Delphi, and for the next several years, the truth. The discovery of Abby and Libby's bodies was only the beginning. The real horror was just setting in. Delphi was no longer just a quiet town in Indiana. It was now the backdrop of a murder mystery that seemed impossible to solve. And worse, the man responsible was still out there. The FBI, Indiana State Police, and Carroll County Sheriff's Department launched one of the largest investigations in the state's history. Teams of officers combed through the crime scene, looking for anything, any clue, any trace of DNA, any footprint in the dirt that could lead them to the person who had taken the lives of two innocent girls. But the scene was strange. There was evidence, but it didn't tell a full story. There were signs of planning, yet also signs of chaos. There were details the investigators refused to release, Clues so sensitive that even years later, the public wouldn't know them. And then, there was the fact that whoever did this had managed to leave without a trace. Or so he thought. Because Libby had recorded him. Days after the discovery, law enforcement released the now infamous image. A grainy, low-resolution photo of a man walking along the Monon High Bridge, hands in pockets, head slightly tilted downward. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then they released the audio. "Guys, down the hill." The voice was deep, controlled, not panicked, not rushed. It was an order, a command, and it was chilling. The public was asked to listen, to study the image, to come forward with any information. Hundreds of tips flooded in. The town was desperate for answers. The country was watching. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who was Bridge Guy? At first, there was hope. This was not a crime buried in secrecy. This was a crime where the victim had captured her killer in real time. That never happened. There was a voice, a face. It felt like an open and shut case. But days passed, then weeks, then months. And nothing. The case that had seemed so solvable had stalled. Investigators followed thousands of leads. They interviewed locals, tracked movements, studied phone records. But nothing led to an arrest. And the town, once fueled by anger and determination, slowly sank into something worse. Fear. Because as the months dragged on, one horrifying thought settled into the minds of everyone in Delphi. What if he was still here? What if Bridge Guy wasn't some outsider who had wandered into town and vanished? What if he was part of the community? What if he was standing in line at the grocery store, walking the same streets, sitting in church on Sundays? What if he was watching? And as the seasons changed, as the leaves turned from green to orange to white with snow, the case grew colder. The tips slowed. The investigation, once moving at a relentless pace, began to stall. No arrests, no suspect, no justice, just silence. But the thing about silence, it never lasts. 2 years passed. 2 long, agonizing years. The town of Delphi had learned to live with the uncertainty, with the unspoken fear that the man who had stolen 2 young lives was still among them. The investigation had not stopped, but it had slowed, as all cases eventually do when the leads dry up, when the public moves on, when time turns even the most urgent mysteries into fading headlines. And then, on April 22, 2019, everything changed. A press conference was called. The room was packed. Reporters, law enforcement, members of the community who had never given up hope. The families of Abby and Libby sat among them, waiting, just as desperate for answers as they had been since that cold day in February 2017. The lead investigator, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter, stepped up to the podium. His face was serious, his tone heavy. Something was different this time, something big. Then they unveiled it. A new sketch, a new face. And it wasn't the man people had spent years searching for. For 2 years, the public had been fixated on a specific image. An older man, stocky, with a slightly rounded face. That was the face everyone had been looking for. That was the face on billboards, on wanted posters, in the minds of those who whispered about Bridge Guy in hushed voices. But the new sketch, it was someone completely different. Younger, thinner, clean-shaven. He looked nothing like the original suspect. Confusion spread like wildfire. Had the police been looking for the wrong man this whole time? Was this someone else? Or had the killer been hiding in plain sight under a different assumption of who he was? Then the bombshell. Superintendent Carter stepped closer to the microphone, his voice unwavering, his message direct. "We believe you are hiding in plain sight," he said. "We likely have interviewed you or someone close to you." The room went still. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a warning. Whoever had killed Abby and Libby, he was watching. He was listening. He was following every detail of the case, every piece of news, every press conference, and law enforcement knew it. Then, another chilling statement. "To the killer who might be in this room," Carter said, his eyes scanning the crowd, "we believe you." It was a message designed to rattle, to shake loose whatever confidence the killer had built up in the years since the crime. And as those words echoed through the room, through television broadcasts, through the ears of the person who needed to hear them most, Delphi held its breath. Because for the first time in 2 years it felt like the noose was tightening, but still, no arrest. The suspect, whoever he was, remained free. And the town of Delphi? It remained trapped in the same nightmare it had been living since February 13, 2017. But the thing about nightmares? Eventually, they end. Years passed, hope faded, tips slowed. The weight of unanswered questions settled over Delphi like an unshakable fog. Every press conference, every update, every new sketch had led to the same crushing reality. Whoever had killed Abby and Libby was still free. For 5 long years, their families waited. For 5 long years, law enforcement worked tirelessly, combing through thousands of leads, chasing ghosts, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that refused to take shape. And then, in October 2022, everything changed. The name Richard Allen had never been one whispered in dark corners. It was not a name that circulated on internet forums, not a name that had drawn suspicion from the community. But when police announced an arrest in connection with the Delphi murders, it was his name they said. Richard Allen. A local. A husband. A father. A man who had lived in Delphi for years. And the most chilling part, he wasn't just anyone. He was someone the town knew. Someone they had interacted with. Someone who had worked at the CVS just down the road, where people had gone to fill prescriptions, buy groceries, make small talk. He was someone who had printed photos for grieving families. Someone who had, in his own way, been a part of the community's healing process. And all the while, if the accusations were true, he had been the monster they were looking for. The arrest stunned Delphi. It stunned the nation. Because this wasn't an outsider, some drifter passing through. No, this was a man who had been there all along. Questions came in a tidal wave. How had he evaded capture for so long? What had led investigators to him after all these years? And most chillingly, had he been watching all this time? Watching the press conferences, the candlelight vigils, the desperate pleas for justice? Had he stood among them, hidden in plain sight, as police had always warned? Then came another revelation, a haunting one. Richard Allen had not only been in Delphi that day, he had been on the Monon High Bridge Trail, and not in secret. He had told police as much himself back in 2017. Yes, Richard Allen had been interviewed in the early days of the investigation. He had voluntarily admitted to being in the area on February 13, 2017. But somehow, for reasons still unclear, he had slipped through the cracks. A man who had allegedly placed himself at the scene of the crime had walked free for over 5 years. Now, as he sat in jail, charged with 2 counts of murder, the world waited. Because an arrest was one thing, a conviction, that was another. Richard Allen had been caught, but was he truly the man responsible? Or was there more to the story? An arrest had been made. The quiet Delphi man who had lived among the very people he was accused of terrorizing was now behind bars. But for all the relief the news brought, the case was far from over. Because now came the trial, and with it a chance for the world to finally hear the truth, or at least, what little truth would be allowed. From the start, this case was different. Most murder trials are built on transparency, evidence presented to the public, arguments made in open court, a clear line from crime to conviction. But Delphi was different. Much of the evidence remained sealed. Prosecutors and investigators refused to reveal key details. The cause of death? Still undisclosed. The exact evidence linking Allen to the crime? Hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Even the crime scene itself had long been described as unusual, a word that carried a weight no one could fully understand. And then the rumors. Strange, unsettling whispers about the crime scene, about markings, about symbols, about a signature left behind by someone who wanted to be remembered. Theories ran wild. Some believed Abby and Libby had been targeted, that this was no random attack. Others feared something darker, something ritualistic, something tied to the eerie undertones that had haunted this case since the beginning. And when court documents were finally unsealed, they only deepened the mystery. Richard Allen, in jail and awaiting trial, had begun to speak, and what he said sent shockwaves through the case. He claimed he was being framed, not by just anyone, but by a shadowy force, a group, a secret organization. His defense attorneys pointed to an alleged Odinist connection, suggesting that Abby and Libby's deaths had been linked to an obscure Norse pagan cult operating in Indiana. They argued that the crime scene bore symbols tied to Odinism and that the real killers had staged everything to remain hidden. For many, it sounded absurd, a desperate man clinging to a desperate story. But for others, it wasn't so easily dismissed, because for years, police had been withholding information, and every new revelation seemed to point to something far more complex than a simple one-man crime. Even more disturbing, Alan's own mental state. The man who had once appeared calm and collected now seemed to be unraveling. In jailhouse letters, he wrote about being tormented, about hearing voices, about suffering psychological abuse behind bars. His physical appearance changed dramatically. Gone was the ordinary Delphi man, replaced by someone gaunt, sunken-eyed, barely recognizable. Had guilt consumed him, or was something else at play? And if he wasn't the sole killer, who else was involved? The trial loomed. The town of Delphi prepared for the moment it had waited years to see, but as more details emerged, one thing became clear. This case was unlike any other, and if Richard Allen was guilty, he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. The weight of 6 long years pressed down on Delphi as the trial finally began. The eyes of the nation were fixed on the courtroom, on the man at the center of it all, Richard Allen. Was he the killer? Or was he simply the convenient scapegoat for a case that had spiraled too far into the unknown? Prosecutors laid out their case. They argued that Allen had been there that day, February 13, 2017, on the Monon High Bridge, waiting. They presented evidence, some of which had never been publicly disclosed before. Physical evidence, forensic evidence. The details were finally coming to light. But then, the defense fought back. They pointed to the years of delays, to the holes in the investigation, to the missing links that had never been fully explained. They questioned how someone could remain in the very town he allegedly terrorized, living openly, working at a CVS where people came and went daily, never once drawing suspicion until 5 years later. And then there was Richard Allen himself. He sat in the courtroom, his once average appearance now haunting. The man who had been arrested in 2022 was no longer the man on trial in 2024. His body had withered, his face hollowed by time, stress, and whatever he had endured behind bars. He mumbled through his statements. At times he seemed incoherent. The question lingered in the air. Was this a man suffering from the weight of his own guilt? Or was this a man being destroyed by forces beyond his control? Then, the moment came. The jury deliberated. Days passed. Hours stretched endlessly. The families of Abby and Libby sat in the courtroom, waiting for the words that would define everything. And then, at last, the verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped, some nodded in silent relief. Others exchanged looks, uncertainty still in their eyes. The judge spoke, the sentence was read. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. For many, this was the long-awaited justice. The moment when Delphi could finally exhale, when Abby and Libby's families could find peace. But for others, questions remained. Had the right man been convicted? Or was there still more to this case? Shadows lurking just out of reach, secrets still buried within the crime scene, within the town, within the people who knew more than they ever let on. One thing was certain. Abby and Libby had finally received their justice, but the full truth of what happened on that cold February day? That may never be known. The case was over. The trial had ended. Richard Allen was sentenced, locked away, his fate sealed within the walls of a prison cell. But for the people of Delphi, for the families of Abby and Libby, for the millions who had followed this case from the beginning, it wasn't that simple. Because long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the news cycle moved on, the echoes of what happened on February 13, 2017, still lingered. 2 young girls went for a walk that day. They laughed, they explored, they took photos, and in their final moments, they did something remarkable, something no one could have expected. They recorded him. Libby German had the presence of mind to capture the man on the bridge, the voice that would haunt the world. Guys, down the hill. In that single act, she gave investigators their most crucial evidence. Even in the face of danger, even in the final moments of her life, she fought for the truth. Their names will never be forgotten. Their faces will never fade. Abby and Libby became more than victims. They became the reason for a movement, for awareness, for change. And though justice has been served, the questions will never fully disappear. Was Richard Allen truly the only one responsible? Were others involved? And most chillingly, are there still secrets waiting to be uncovered? What happened on that trail will forever remain one of the darkest chapters in Delphi's history. A case that began with two girls enjoying a day in the woods ended in a way no one could have imagined. And even now, as the case is considered solved, its mystery will always remain. Because in the end, Delphi was never just about one man. It was about the shadows that exist in every small town, the dangers that hide in plain sight, and the truth that may never be fully revealed. If you want to hear more deep, unsettling true crime cases like this one, make sure to subscribe. There are still stories that need to be told, and we're just getting started.